April 28, 2026. On an earnings call with investors and analysts, Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury faced a question he clearly would have preferred to avoid. Why had Airbus just posted its worst first-quarter commercial aircraft delivery total since 2009? His answer, delivered in careful, measured corporate language, was a single, oddly bureaucratic phrase: an administrative delay in China. That phrase was doing a lot of quiet work to downplay what had actually been happening behind the scenes for months. According to Bloomberg reporting, citing people familiar with the matter, China's own aviation regulator had been deliberately holding up the approvals required for nearly 20 Airbus aircraft to enter the country and begin flying for their Chinese customers. A slowdown that landed at precisely the moment China was pressing Europe's own aviation regulator to speed up certification of COMAC's homegrown C919 jet. In plain terms, China appears to have quietly used its own airline's brand new Airbus jets as leverage, sitting on the ground instead of flying passengers, specifically to pressure European regulators into moving faster on approving China's own domestic competitor to those exact same aircraft. Let's establish the actual mechanics of what happened, because the story here is genuinely fascinating once you understand the regulatory relationship it's built around. According to Aerotime's detailed reporting, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, the CAAC, held up specific approvals required for Airbus aircraft to formally enter Chinese airspace and begin commercial service, even though those aircraft had already been built, delivered, and were sitting ready to fly. That reporting connects the timing directly to a separate parallel process. Back in January of 2026, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, ESA, confirmed it had conducted actual test flights of the C919 in Shanghai, part of the formal validation work required, before Europe would grant the Chinese jet its own certification to fly in European airspace. At the time, ESA offered no specific timeline for when that certification process might actually conclude. According to Aerospace Global News coverage of the same situation, ESA's own executive director, Florian Guillermet, had previously cautioned that full approval could still take anywhere between 3 and 6 years. Time regulators say they need to properly assess the aircraft's design integration, its onboard systems, and its overall operational reliability, a notably unhurried timeline for a European regulator that, according to this same reporting, China appeared increasingly frustrated by. The financial and operational consequences of China's slowdown were real, immediate, and large enough to show up clearly in Airbus's own quarterly results. According to that same Aerospace Global News reporting, the delayed approvals affected nearly 20 aircraft specifically bound for Chinese customers and directly contributed to Airbus posting its lowest first-quarter commercial aircraft delivery total since 2009, a stretch of 17 consecutive years without a worse opening quarter. That's a genuinely significant hit for a company of Airbus's scale, and it lands with even more weight once you understand exactly how important China is to Airbus's overall business. That same reporting quotes context, establishing that China represents Airbus's largest single-country market anywhere in the world in terms of total fleet size, meaning any disruption to deliveries there isn't some peripheral inconvenience. It strikes directly at the company's single most important national market. Why would China risk friction with its own largest Airbus customer base just to pressure European regulators over a separate jet entirely? The strategic logic becomes clear once you understand exactly what's riding on ESA certification for COMAC's own program. According to Aerotime's reporting, ESA certification would mark a major step in COMAC's effort to move beyond China's domestic market and sell the C919 to Western carriers. And crucially, without either European or American FAA certification, the aircraft remains largely limited to Chinese and some non-Western markets. That's the entire ballgame for COMAC's international ambitions, sitting in one regulatory approval. China has already built the aircraft, already flown it commercially within its own borders since 2023, and already secured firm domestic orders from its own major state-linked airlines. What it doesn't have and cannot manufacture through sheer industrial capacity or state subsidy alone is the international regulatory credibility that comes from an ESA or FAA stamp of approval, the exact kind of approval that would finally let airlines and leasing companies in Europe, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere seriously consider buying the aircraft, instead of simply watching it fly domestically inside China. This apparent pressure campaign wasn't happening in isolation either. It arrived alongside a formal published policy warning from a respected American think tank, one specifically calling for coordinated Western action against exactly this kind of Chinese industrial strategy. According to Aviation News coverage, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, known as ITIF, released a comprehensive research report warning that state-backed COMAC poses a significant threat to global aerospace markets, detailing how billions of dollars in what the report describes as unfair industrial subsidies from Beijing have allowed COMAC to bypass typical market-driven development timelines entirely. The report's central policy recommendation was direct and confrontational. It advised Western governments to coordinate market access restrictions, specifically to ensure that state-subsidized Chinese aerospace products cannot freely dismantle the established duopoly of Boeing and Airbus. Notably, though, that same report was honest enough to include an important technical caveat, one that echoes everything already established in earlier research on this exact program. Despite China's aggressive domestic manufacturing push, COMAC remains deeply dependent on Western components, particularly for propulsion, a reminder that even as Beijing pressures Europe over certification timelines, the aircraft in question still can't fly without a Western-built engine bolted onto each wing. The actual scale of COMAC's production numbers, once you look past the political maneuvering entirely, tells a genuinely humbling story about just how far this threat to Boeing and Airbus actually sits from matching its own stated ambitions. According to detailed reporting from Aviation Today, COMAC had originally planned to deliver 30 C919 jets during 2025, while separately targeting a production capacity ramp-up toward 50 aircraft annually. That ambition was actually raised even higher in March of 2025, when the company set a more aggressive internal goal of 75 total deliveries for the year. The actual result, according to Fliegerfaust's reporting, citing Flightmaster data presented at the Singapore Air Show, landed dramatically short of every one of those targets. COMAC delivered just 32 C919 aircraft to Chinese carriers by the end of 2025. 32 against an original target of 30 that was later revised upward to 75, a gap serious enough that Aviation Today's own analysis notes some industry analysts have openly dismissed COMAC's ambitions as a lot of nationalistic hype. A genuinely blunt assessment for trade press coverage to include. There's a broader, more sophisticated way to understand exactly what China's overall strategy actually is here, one that goes well beyond a simple binary of replacing Boeing and Airbus outright. A detailed analysis from Clean Technica frames it precisely. Boeing and Airbus will continue supplying China because its airlines need aircraft faster than COMAC can build them. That same analysis argues Airbus specifically benefits right now from deeper local industrial roots through its existing Tianjin assembly operation in China, along with less direct exposure to broader US-China tensions than Boeing currently faces, making Airbus, in the analysis's own words, a bridge, not the intended endpoint. China isn't trying to swap dependence on Boeing for dependence on Airbus instead. It's using whichever foreign manufacturing capacity remains genuinely useful, Airbus included, while simultaneously building out its own domestic capability in parallel, exactly the same layered strategy the analysis notes China has already deployed successfully across high-speed rail, batteries, solar equipment, electric vehicles, shipbuilding, and grid technology. And in a detail that genuinely undercuts the entire Airbus is mad framing, the actual commercial relationship between Airbus and its Chinese customers continued moving forward robustly even in the middle of this exact regulatory standoff. According to Travel Radar's reporting dated July 17, 2026, just months after Forey's tense earnings call comments about administrative delays, Air China and its subsidiary Shenzhen Airlines placed firm orders for a combined 55 new aircraft directly with Airbus, including 40 brand new A320neo family jets specifically allocated to Shenzhen Airlines, with deliveries scheduled to run between 2029 and 2032. That's not the behavior of a business relationship in genuine crisis. It's a major Chinese state airline group placing a substantial, multi-year Airbus order at essentially the same moment its own national regulator was reportedly slow-walking approvals for previously delivered Airbus jets, underscoring that China's real strategy here isn't punishing Airbus itself, but rather using its considerable regulatory and market leverage as one tool among several, pressure applied selectively and temporarily, specifically aimed at accelerating a European certification process for its own domestic jet, while the underlying commercial relationship with Airbus continues largely intact underneath it. So here's the honest, fully accurate version of what China actually did, and what it means for both Airbus and COMAC. China's aviation regulator did appear to slow-walk delivery approvals for a real, measurable batch of nearly 20 Airbus aircraft, a move that genuinely contributed to Airbus's worst first-quarter delivery numbers in 17 years, and the timing lines up closely enough with China's broader push for EASA certification of the C919 that Bloomberg's sourcing and multiple aviation trade outlets have connected the two directly. Airbus's own leadership, notably, chose to publicly downplay the entire episode as a mere administrative delay, rather than treating it as a genuine crisis, and continued signing substantial new aircraft orders with major Chinese carriers within the same year. Meanwhile, COMAC's own underlying production reality, missing its own delivery targets by more than half, even after revising them upward, remaining deeply dependent on Western-supplied engines, and still lacking any completed ESA or FAA certification, as of the most recent reporting, tells a story of a company still years away from genuinely threatening Airbus's global market position, regardless of how much regulatory pressure Beijing is willing to apply in the meantime. It's a real, documented instance of China flexing genuine industrial and regulatory leverage on Europe. It just isn't remotely the story of Airbus panicking or of COMAC suddenly becoming the aerospace threat the headline wants you to believe it already is. Here's roughly 3,000 more words extending the script, with a specific, brand new development that actually anchors this exact headline moment: the C9-19-600 Plateau jet, which completed its maiden flight just this week on July 29, 2026. There's a second, entirely separate story unfolding at almost the exact same moment as the Airbus delivery slowdown, and it deserves its own space, because it reveals a much more specific, much more calculated version of COMAC's actual strategy than any broad threat to Boeing and Airbus framing captures. On Wednesday, July 29th, 2026, just days ago as of this writing, COMAC's high-altitude narrow-body variant, officially designated the C9-19-600 and nicknamed the Plateau, completed its maiden flight, departing from Shanghai Pudong International Airport and returning roughly 2 hours later, according to Flight Global's reporting, having completed all of its scheduled test items. This isn't a variant aimed at directly outselling Airbus's A320 or Boeing's 737 in the general global marketplace. It's something considerably narrower and considerably cleverer. A purpose-built aircraft designed to compete in one of the only corners of commercial aviation where Airbus genuinely holds something close to an outright monopoly: the small, extraordinarily demanding market for airports, sitting thousands of meters above sea level. To understand why this specific aircraft matters, you first need to understand exactly how brutal the operating environment it's designed for actually is. According to Airways magazine's detailed technical breakdown, the challenge these aircraft face comes down to basic physics. At extremely high elevation, the air is measurably thinner, which reduces both engine power output and aerodynamic lift simultaneously, forcing aircraft to require considerably longer runways just to safely take off and land. That same reporting notes Tibet Airlines, the launch customer for this new variant, operates out of Lhasa Airport sitting at 3,370 meters and flies routes into airports even more extreme, including Komdo at an elevation of 4,311 meters above sea level. Simple Flying's coverage adds further scale to just how demanding these conditions are. Lhasa Airport alone sits at 11,910 feet, an altitude most commercial pilots anywhere else in the world will simply never encounter across an entire career flying more conventional routes. Airbus has effectively owned this specific narrow niche for years, not because of some grand strategic plan, but simply because it happened to be the manufacturer whose aircraft could actually be modified to survive these conditions. According to that same Airways magazine reporting, Tibet Airlines currently operates a fleet of Airbus A319ceo and A319neo aircraft specifically adapted for high-altitude operation. And TechTime's coverage confirms the airline's existing fleet consists of Airbus A319 jets specifically modified for exactly this purpose. That's the Airbus altitude monopoly the original headline framing gestures toward, and it's a genuinely real, if genuinely tiny, corner of the global aviation market. Airlines serving Tibetan plateau routes and a handful of similarly extreme elevation airports elsewhere in the world essentially have no choice but Airbus's specially modified A319 family, because nobody else has built anything else capable of safely operating there. COMAC's approach to challenging that narrow monopoly reveals a strategy considerably more sophisticated than simply building a bigger, more powerful competitor from scratch. According to Airways magazine's reporting, the formal cooperation agreement between COMAC and Tibet Airlines, since rebranded Shizong Airlines, was signed all the way back in December of 2023, establishing the airline not just as a future customer, but as an actual development partner in designing the aircraft itself. TechTimes' reporting fills in exactly how deep that partnership actually runs. The airline currently flies a fleet of Airbus A319 aircraft modified for high-altitude operations, and it has been operating plateau routes long enough that its engineers provided direct input into the C9-19-600's design requirements. In other words, COMAC didn't design this aircraft in isolation and then go looking for a customer. It brought in the one airline on Earth with the deepest, most specific operational experience actually flying commercial jets in exactly these brutal conditions, and let that airline's own engineers help shape the aircraft's technical requirements from the ground up. The specific engineering changes required to make a standard narrow-body jet survive high-altitude operation are genuinely substantial, and multiple sources lay out the technical picture in useful detail, according to Aviation. Direct's reporting, the modifications go well beyond simply shrinking the aircraft. System modifications were also made, including adjustments to the cabin oxygen systems and modifications to the engine controls and landing gear brakes for operation on shorter runways or under altered pressurization conditions. A separate report from China eVTOL News adds an even more specific safety detail. The aircraft's emergency oxygen supply has been extended from the standard 15 minutes found on a normal C919 up to a full 60 minutes. A meaningful safety margin increase clearly designed around the reality that an emergency descent from a high-altitude plateau airport to a safe, breathable altitude simply takes longer than it would from a conventional sea-level route. That same reporting also notes the addition of Beidou satellite navigation with RNP-AR precision approach capability, China's own domestic satellite navigation system, integrated specifically to support the kind of precision instrument approaches these challenging mountain airports require. The physical transformation of the airframe itself is equally significant. According to Flight Global's reporting, the high-altitude variant seats around 140 passengers, compared to the baseline model's standard layout of 164 seats, a meaningful reduction achieved, according to Simple Flying's more detailed breakdown, by physically removing 6 fuselage frames from the aircraft's body to reduce overall weight, a critical requirement given how much lift and engine performance is already sacrificed simply by operating in thin mountain air. Aviation Week's coverage confirms the aircraft, registered B0S2U for testing purposes, is explicitly designed for operations at airports on the Tibetan Plateau and other high elevation regions, while COMAC itself, according to that same Aviation Week reporting, described the maiden flight as an important step forward in the series development of C919 aircraft. The commercial commitment underpinning this specific variant is real and substantial, at least on paper, even if it remains confined to a single customer for now. According to Flight Global's reporting, Xizong Airlines signed a firm order for 40 C919-600 aircraft at the 2024 Singapore Air Show, and Airways magazine confirms that agreement was formalized specifically at that February 2024 event. 40 aircraft is a genuinely significant order for a niche variant serving a genuinely small, specialized market, one where, as Aerospace Global News' own coverage bluntly puts it, describing the broader strategy at play here, solid niche strategy, not trying to beat giants everywhere at once. That framing deserves real emphasis because it captures something important about how to correctly interpret this specific aircraft's actual significance, as opposed to the targeting Airbus's monopoly language some coverage leans into. TechTime's own reporting includes a genuinely sharp, clarifying observation about exactly why this specific market works so well for a still unproven Chinese aircraft. One worth quoting directly because it explains the entire underlying strategic logic. The airline has an incentive, and a government directive, to fly domestic aircraft on those routes. That captive market arrangement is precisely the condition that makes a niche aircraft viable. The aircraft doesn't need to win the market. It just needs to win the mandate. That's a genuinely important distinction. Xizong Airlines isn't choosing the C919-600 purely because it's judged, through open competitive evaluation, to be the objectively superior aircraft for high-altitude operations. It's flying it because Chinese state policy directs it to a captive domestic customer base that removes almost all of the normal commercial risk COMAC would otherwise face, trying to convince an airline to bet its safety record on an unproven high-altitude jet with zero operational track record. And that lack of independent verification is a genuinely important caveat that responsible reporting on this milestone has been careful to include, rather than simply repeating COMAC's own confident marketing framing. TechTime's reporting states this directly and unambiguously. The C919-600's hot and high-performance claims, improved thrust-to-weight ratio, enhanced aerodynamics, better climb performance, come from COMAC and its co-developer Xizong Airlines. No independent regulator or third-party auditor has yet evaluated the aircraft's actual performance in plateau conditions. That verification will only begin when flight testing moves to high-altitude airports, which is not yet scheduled. Read that carefully. The maiden flight that just happened, the one generating all of this fresh headline attention, took place at Shanghai Pudong Airport, sitting at essentially sea level on China's eastern coast, nowhere near the actual high-altitude conditions this aircraft is specifically being built to handle. China eVTOL News' reporting confirms that genuinely difficult testing still lies ahead. Following the maiden flight, the prototype will undergo a series of research and test flights over the next year, including environmental adaptability validation at high-altitude airports in Qinghai and Tibet, with that same reporting noting COMAC's own stated goal of completing full type certification and entering commercial service by 2028, though the manufacturer itself, notably, has not confirmed a timeline for that target. There's an earlier, smaller-scale data-gathering step in this story worth including, too, because it shows COMAC's approach here has actually been methodical rather than rushed. even if the ultimate certification timeline remains genuinely uncertain. According to Airways Magazine's reporting, back in September of 2024, well before this dedicated high-altitude variant was even built, COMAC conducted test flights of the standard, unmodified C919 directly at Lhasa Gongor Airport, specifically to gather baseline performance data at real altitude before finalizing the specific engineering enhancements the 600 variant would ultimately need. That's a genuinely sensible engineering approach. Fly the existing aircraft in the real target environment first, collect hard data on exactly how it struggles there, and only then design the specific structural and systems modifications needed to fix those exact problems, rather than guessing at solutions in a wind tunnel and hoping they translate to reality. Now, connect this specific high-altitude story back to the broader Airbus delivery slowdown covered in the earlier part of this script, because together they paint a genuinely coherent, if considerably more modest, picture of China's actual aerospace strategy than any single shocked Airbus headline captures on its own. China isn't pursuing one single sweeping campaign to dethrone Airbus across the entire global aviation market overnight. It's running several separate, carefully targeted efforts simultaneously, pressuring European regulators through delivery approval slowdowns specifically to accelerate certification for its mainstream C919 competitor to the A320 and 737, while separately building an entirely different purpose-built variant specifically engineered to challenge Airbus's narrow monopoly over one of the most technically demanding, commercially small niches in all of commercial aviation, high-altitude plateau routes, using a captive domestic customer with a government mandate to guarantee that niche aircraft a viable launch market regardless of how it actually performs against independent scrutiny. Both of these efforts are genuinely real, genuinely worth tracking, and genuinely represent serious, well-resourced attempts by China to chip away at a duopoly that has dominated global commercial aviation for decades. Neither of them, based on everything the actual documented evidence shows as of this week, represents Airbus as suddenly panicking, or COMAC suddenly, unexpectedly becoming a company capable of matching Airbus's global reach, reliability record, or regulatory credibility. The broader C919 program is still missing its own revised delivery targets by wide margins, still fundamentally dependent on Western-built engines it doesn't yet have a working domestic replacement for, and still, as of the most recent reporting available, holds no completed EASA or FAA certification despite years of pursuing exactly that milestone. China is making real, patient, methodical progress across multiple fronts at once. It just isn't the sudden, shocking, Airbus panicking story a clickbait headline wants you to believe has already arrived.